The war was a symphony of complex machinery. The supermarine Spitfire, a marvel of aeronautical design, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine of immense power. Yet the fate of Britain's fighter pilots rested not on a new superweapon, but on a piece of brass no larger than a coin. A simple washer. This is the story of how one woman's elegant 50-cent solution defied a multi-million-dollar engineering crisis and turned the tide in the skies over Europe, saving thousands of lives. To understand the scale of this achievement, we must first climb into the cockpit of a Royal Air Force fighter in the skies of 1940. Below you, the green fields of Kent. Around you, the vast, cold blue of the heavens. This is the arena where the fate of the free world is being decided, not by armies, but by a handful of young men in their incredible flying machines. Your aircraft, whether the iconic Spitfire or its rugged workhorse sibling, the Hawker Hurricane, is powered by the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It is a masterpiece of engineering, a 12-cylinder beast that sings a song of pure power. In a straight dogfight, a turning battle, you are the master of the sky. The agility of your airframe and the reliability of your engine give you an edge, but the enemy is cunning. The Luftwaffe pilots in their Messerschmitt Bf-109s have discovered a flaw, a ghost in your machine. It is a subtle vulnerability, but in the brutal calculus of aerial combat, it is a fatal one. The German pilot breaks away. Instead of banking or climbing, he does something that seems counterintuitive. He pushes his control stick forward, bunting the nose of his aircraft down into a sudden, aggressive dive. This is a negative G maneuver. For the pilot, it creates a stomach-churning sensation of weightlessness, pulling him up against his straps. For his Daimler-Benz engine, it is nothing. Its direct fuel injection system, a more advanced technology for its time, forces fuel directly into the cylinders, regardless of orientation or gravitational force. The German fighter accelerates away, a clean and perfect escape. Now it is your turn. You push your own stick forward to follow, to keep him in your sights. And in that instant, your Merlin engine, your trusted powerhouse, dies. The roar of 12 cylinders vanishes, replaced by a terrifying silence, broken only by the whistle of wind over your canopy. For 2, maybe 3 agonizing seconds, your Spitfire is no longer a weapon. It is a glider, a falling leaf. The cause of this life-or-death failure was a component that had served aviation faithfully for decades. The Skinner's Union, or SU float carburetor. In essence, it worked like a miniature fuel tank, with a float that regulated the flow of gasoline into the engine. Under normal flight conditions, gravity kept the fuel at the bottom and the float bobbing on top. But when a pilot pushed into a negative G dive, the laws of physics turned against him. The heavy fuel would be thrown upwards, swamping the float and flooding the carburetor. The engine would choke, starved of the proper air-fuel mixture. The RAF's greatest weapon had an Achilles heel, and the Germans knew exactly where to strike. Every dogfight became a rigged game. A Luftwaffe pilot who found himself in trouble had a get-out-of-jail-free card. Just push the stick forward. The British pilot faced an impossible choice. Follow the German into the dive and pray your engine restarted before he could turn and fire on you. Or break off the attack, let the enemy escape, and live to fight another day. It was a tactical advantage that was bleeding fighter command dry, pilot by precious pilot. The engineers at Rolls-Royce knew the answer was a new pressure carburetor, but developing one would take years. Britain didn't have years. It had weeks, maybe months. A solution was needed, and it needed to be found now. The call for a solution echoed from the airfields of southern England to the nation's top engineering minds. While Rolls-Royce's finest worked on a long-term, systemic fix, the immediate crisis landed on the desks of a unique institution, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, or RAE, at Farnborough. The RAE was the technical conscience of the Royal Air Force, a sprawling campus of wind tunnels, laboratories, and workshops filled with brilliant, often eccentric scientists and engineers. Their job was to break things, to test theories to destruction, and to solve the unsolvable problems that emerge from the crucible of combat. It was here, amidst the scent of oil and ozone, that a remarkable engineer named Beatrice Shilling worked. Shilling, known to her friends and colleagues as Tilly, was a force of nature in a world dominated by men. She held a master's degree in mechanical engineering and possessed a fierce, practical intelligence that was legendary at Farnborough. She was no cloistered academic. Shilling was famous for roaring up to the RA gates on her powerful Norton motorcycle, which she tuned and maintained herself, often racing it to speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. This hands-on, grease-under-the-fingernails familiarity with engines gave her a perspective that many of her more theoretical colleagues lacked. She understood the intricate dance of fuel, air, and steel not just from diagrams, but as a living, breathing process. The problem of the Merlin's carburetor was assigned to her department. While committees debated and complex redesigns were sketched out, Shilling approached the challenge with a pragmatist's eye. She knew a brand-new carburetor was the correct engineering solution, but she also knew it was years away. The pilots falling from the sky didn't have years. They needed a fix, a patch, a bodge, as the British would say. And they needed it yesterday. Her mind, honed by tuning her Norton's engine for peak performance, went straight to the heart of the matter. The problem was a momentary surge, a sudden glut of fuel. The engine wasn't failing. It was drowning. So she reasoned, what if you could simply restrict the flow? What if you could create a bottleneck in the fuel line just before the carburetor's float chamber? A device that would allow enough fuel for maximum power under normal conditions, but would physically prevent the massive engine-choking surge during that critical 2-second window of a negative G dive. The idea was breathtaking in its simplicity. It wasn't a redesign. It was an intervention. She sketched out her device. It was a small, thimble-shaped flow restrictor, a piece of brass with a precisely calculated hole or orifice drilled through its center. It was, in effect, a metal washer. It could be machined quickly, cheaply, and in vast numbers. It could be fitted into the existing fuel system with minimal modification. It was not a perfect solution. Under sustained negative G, the engine would still eventually be starved of fuel, but it would eliminate that initial deadly stall. It would give the pilot those crucial seconds he needed to keep the enemy in his sights and his own engine roaring. She had her elegant 50-cent answer to the multi-million-dollar problem. But an idea on a blueprint is one thing. Convincing the RAF to drill holes in the fuel lines of their priceless fighter planes based on the theory of a civilian engineer was another challenge entirely. The next battle would not be fought in the skies, but in the halls of bureaucracy and on the frozen tarmac of an active air base. Beatrice Shilling's simple brass restrictor was a stroke of genius on paper, but the path from a Farnborough workshop to the fuel line of a Spitfire was an administrative minefield. The Royal Air Force, like any military organization, ran on procedure and protocol. Modifying a critical component like the fuel system of their frontline fighter was not a decision to be taken lightly. It required committees, extensive ground testing, flight trials, and mountains of paperwork. Every step was designed to ensure safety and reliability. But in the spring of 1941, this methodical process was a luxury Britain could not afford. Pilots were being lost daily. The tactical imbalance over the Channel was not just costing aircraft. It was eroding the morale of fighter command. Schilling, a woman of action, grew increasingly frustrated. She saw the elegant simplicity of her solution being bogged down in bureaucratic inertia. She knew that every day spent in committee meetings was another day a pilot might face that terrifying, engine-choking silence in a dive. Her conviction was absolute, and her patience was wearing thin. So she made a decision that could have ended her career. If the system would not move, she would go around it. On the morning of March 14th, 1941, she drove not to her office at the RAE, but to the active fighter station at RAF Kenley. In her pocket, she carried a handful of the small, precisely machined brass restrictors. This was not an official visit sanctioned by the Air Ministry. It was a clandestine mission, a gamble born of desperation and certainty. At Kenley, she didn't seek out the station commander or the chief engineering officer. She sought out a man who understood the problem from the sharp end, Sergeant William Cooper, a senior non-commissioned officer in charge of a ground crew. Cooper was not a man of theory. He was a man of metal, oil, and consequence. He was the one who patched up the battle-damaged aircraft and saw the empty cockpits of the pilots who didn't return. Schilling laid out the problem and her proposed solution, not with complex charts, but with straightforward mechanical logic. She showed him the small brass device. It wasn't about abstract aerodynamics. It was about preventing a fuel flood. Cooper, a seasoned mechanic, understood instantly. He saw the logic, the simplicity, and the potential. He also saw the immense risk. What they were contemplating was a court-martial offense, performing an unauthorized modification to an active service aircraft. Yet the choice was between the risk of a court-martial and the certainty of more dead pilots. For Sergeant Cooper, the decision was clear. Under the gray morning sky, away from the prying eyes of the officers' mess, they chose their test aircraft, a Hawker Hurricane. With practiced efficiency, Cooper and his team opened the engine cowling. It was a form of mechanical surgery, conducted with hushed urgency. Schilling was there not as a distant academic, but as a hands-on supervisor, pointing out precisely where the fuel line needed to be cut and the small restrictor inserted. The final piece of this conspiracy of common sense was the pilot, Squadron Leader Davies. He had been briefed on the unofficial experiment and the potentially fatal risks. His engine could seize or fail at the worst possible moment. But like Cooper, Davies lived with the Merlin's flaw every time he flew. The chance to finally neutralize the Bf-109's deadly trick was a risk he was willing to take. As Davies climbed into his cockpit, the small, illicit piece of brass sat silently within the heart of his machine. The test would not happen in the controlled safety of a trial flight. It would happen on his next combat sortie. The scramble bell could ring at any moment, sending him hurtling into the sky, where the first true test of Miss Shilling's Orifice would be against an enemy fighter, with victory or death as the only possible results. The wait on the ground at RAF Kenley was a unique form of torment. For Beatrice Schilling and Sergeant Cooper, the minutes stretched into an eternity. They had committed a profound breach of military discipline. placing their faith in a small piece of metal and the skill of one pilot. Their careers, and more importantly, squadron leader Davies' life, now hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of a combat patrol over the English Channel. They could only scan the skies and listen to the distant hum of aero engines, hoping for good news. High above the coast of Dungeness, Davies was leading his section. The moment of truth arrived sooner than anyone expected. A formation of Luftwaffe bombers escorted by Messerschmitt fighters was spotted. The familiar, deadly ballet of aerial combat began. Davies maneuvered his Hurricane into an attack position, closing in on his target. As he prepared to fire, a German Bf-109 pilot saw the threat and reacted with textbook precision. He pushed his stick forward, bunning his fighter into a steep, high-speed dive, confident that the trailing Hurricane would be left floundering, its engine momentarily dead. It was the Germans' signature move, the tactical trump card they had played to lethal effect for months. Davies did not hesitate. He pushed his own stick forward, nosing the Hurricane over to follow the diving Messerschmitt. This was the critical second. On any previous day, this action would have resulted in a gut-wrenching lurch, a sudden, terrifying silence from the Merlin engine. The pilot would have been a passenger in a falling machine, watching his prey escape. But this time, something was different. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, now breathing through Schilling's restrictor, didn't miss a beat. The familiar roar remained constant, a continuous surge of power. The carburetor, shielded from the sudden flood of fuel, performed flawlessly. For the first time, a British pilot could stick to a Bf-109 in a negative G dive. The German pilot, glancing back, must have felt a shock of disbelief. The Hurricane was still there, glued to his tail, its guns spitting fire. The hunter had become the hunted. The tactical equation that had defined these encounters had been irrevocably altered in a single moment. Back at Kenley, the sound of returning aircraft sent a jolt of anxiety through the small group of conspirators. They watched as Davies' Hurricane touched down and taxied to its hardstand. The engine sputtered to a halt, and as the canopy slid back, the pilot's expression was all they needed to see. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He gave a jubilant thumbs up. The device had worked. It had worked perfectly, under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The news of the successful, albeit highly irregular combat test spread like wildfire. What had been a career-ending gamble just hours before was now being hailed as a miracle solution. The official channels, so recently a source of frustration, now moved with lightning speed. The Air Ministry, faced with undeniable proof from the battlefield, bypassed its own lengthy protocols. Schilling's restrictor, born from a moment of brilliant pragmatism and tested through an act of professional rebellion, was given immediate, top priority approval. Beatrice Shilling was no longer a rogue engineer. She was a national asset. She was tasked with leading mobile teams of technicians, moving from one fighter station to the next. They worked around the clock in freezing hangars and on wind-swept dispersal fields at major air bases like RAF Biggin Hill, installing the small but vital modification across the whole of fighter command. The pilots, the men whose lives depended on the fix, quickly gave the device an affectionate and slightly cheeky nickname, a nod to its inventor and its function. It became universally known as Miss Shilling's Orifice. The widespread installation of Miss Shilling's Orifice across Fighter Command in April of 1941 was not just a technical upgrade, it was a profound psychological turning point for the pilots of the Royal Air Force. For months they had fought with a known handicap, a hidden vulnerability that forced them to fly with a degree of caution. Every engagement carried the risk that their opponent could simply dive away to safety, leaving them powerless. This constant tactical disadvantage was a heavy burden, breeding frustration and eroding the aggressive spirit that is the hallmark of a fighter pilot. Suddenly, that burden was lifted. The modification transformed their confidence. Pilots now knew they could follow a Bf-109 anywhere, through any maneuver, without fear of their engine quitting. The sky, once a three-dimensional chessboard with a set of rules that favored the enemy, was now a level playing field. A Spitfire or Hurricane pilot could now dictate the terms of the engagement, using the superior turning ability of their own aircraft to full effect, knowing that the Germans' vertical escape route had been slammed shut. This newfound aggression was almost immediately reflected in combat statistics, and the results were stark. The numbers tell a story more powerful than any anecdote. Before the introduction of the restrictor, the RAF's kill-to-loss ratio against the Luftwaffe was often precarious. For instance, in March of 1941, the month of Schilling's unauthorized test, Fighter Command scored roughly 1.3 victories for every aircraft lost in combat. It was a positive ratio, but the margins were thin, and the cost in experienced pilots was unsustainable. Then came April, the month of the Great Modification. As Schilling's teams worked their way across the airfields of southern England, the change was dramatic. The kill-to-loss ratio for that month jumped to an astonishing 3.2 to 1. The RAF was now downing more than 3 German aircraft for every one of their own they lost. This wasn't a statistical anomaly. It was a revolution in tactical effectiveness. The data on engine performance was even more direct. Reports of engine failure during dives, which had been a constant and alarming feature of combat reports, plummeted. The percentage of Merlins cutting out in negative G maneuvers dropped from a worrying 38% to less than 1%. The ghost in the machine had been exorcised. The impact was felt keenly on the other side of the channel. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to their get-out-of-jail-free card, suddenly found it revoked. Their trusted escape tactic was now a death trap. Pushing the stick forward no longer guaranteed safety. It often just meant a determined Spitfire would be following them all the way down. The psychological shock to the German fighter arm was significant. Their technological edge, the one clear advantage their Bf-109 held over its British counterparts, had vanished overnight, thanks to a small, unassuming piece of brass. The legacy of this single, simple invention was therefore twofold. On a technical level, it was a masterpiece of pragmatic, results-driven engineering. It solved a complex problem with an almost absurdly simple device. But on a human level, its impact was arguably even greater. It restored faith in the machine, unleashed the full combat potential of Britain's pilots, and injected a new wave of confidence and lethality into fighter command at a critical juncture in the war. It was a textbook example of how a small piece of hardware could change the software of a fighting force. The courage, belief, and will to win. The name for the device, coined in a moment of workshop banter by the great Rolls-Royce engineer, Sir Stanley Hooker, stuck fast. Miss Shilling's Orifice entered the lexicon of the RAF, a term of respect and gratitude for the woman who gave them back their edge. One of the most remarkable aspects of Beatrice Shilling's invention was its longevity. It was conceived and implemented as a stopgap measure, a clever field modification designed to hold the line until the proper engineering solution could be developed and deployed. The ultimate fix, a sophisticated pressure carburetor from Bendix, was already in the pipeline. This new carburetor was a far more advanced piece of equipment that would not only solve the negative G problem completely, but also offer improved engine performance across a range of altitudes and conditions. By 1943, these new carburetors began to arrive from Rolls-Royce and were fitted to the latest marks of Spitfire and other Merlin-powered aircraft rolling off the production lines. In theory, this should have made Miss Shilling's Orifice obsolete. It had served its purpose with distinction, and its time had passed. However, the reality on the front lines was far more complex. The war effort was a colossal logistical enterprise, and retrofitting an entire air force with new components was a slow and painstaking process. Priority for the new pressure carburetors naturally went to the newest fighters being deployed to the most active combat zones. This left thousands of older, but still vital, aircraft in service with the original float carburetor system. This included earlier models of Spitfires and Hurricanes that were now serving in training roles, coastal defense, or in less intense theaters of war. For these aircraft, the simple brass restrictor remained the only defense against engine cutout, and it was a defense that had proven itself to be almost flawlessly reliable. Ground crews trusted it. Pilots understood its limitations and valued its life-saving function. It was simple to maintain, had no moving parts, and almost never failed. As a result, the temporary fix, designed in 1941, remained in service on many RAF aircraft well into 1944 and even beyond. A student pilot learning to fly a Tiger Moth, a reconnaissance pilot in an early model Mustang, or a ferry pilot delivering an older Hurricane could all find themselves flying a machine whose engine was protected by Schilling's elegant 3-year-old solution. It became a permanent part of the Merlin engine's wartime story, a testament to the old engineering adage that perfect is the enemy of good. The pressure carburetor was undoubtedly the perfect solution, but Schilling's Orifice was the good solution that was available when it was needed most. Its continued presence in so many aircraft for so long underscores the sheer effectiveness of its design. It was a wartime fix that was so good, so reliable, and so simple that the urgency to replace it on older airframes simply wasn't there. It became a textbook case, studied by engineers for generations, on the power of pragmatic problem-solving under pressure. It demonstrated that sometimes the most effective answer to a high-technology problem isn't more high technology, but a moment of profound mechanical insight. The story of the brass washer became a quiet legend within the engineering corps, a morale-boosting tale of how ingenuity could triumph over adversity. For her critical contribution to the war effort, Beatrice Shilling was officially recognized in 1948 when she was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, or OBE. It was a formal acknowledgement of a truth that thousands of pilots already knew, that her quick thinking and bold action had saved countless lives and helped turn the tide in the war for air supremacy. Her simple device had given them a fighting chance when they needed it most, and it continued to protect them long after the crisis had passed. When Beatrice Shilling passed away on November 18, 1990, she left behind a legacy that was far greater than a single clever invention. Her story transcends the technical details of fluid dynamics and carburetor design. It is a powerful lesson in the nature of wartime innovation, a testament to the idea that the course of history can be turned not only by grand strategies and mighty armies, but by a single individual with a clear idea and the courage to see it through. The saga of the small brass washer is a perfect microcosm of the Allied spirit at its best, pragmatic, resourceful, and unyielding in the face of a challenge. It stands in stark contrast to the stereotype of a monolithic, top-down war machine. Here was a solution that didn't come from a high-level committee or a state-funded super project. It came from one woman, a brilliant engineer who was also a hands-on mechanic, someone who understood engines not as abstract diagrams but as living things. Her deep personal experience tuning her Norton motorcycle gave her an intuitive feel for the problem that others lacked. She didn't just see a flaw in a blueprint, she felt the momentary choke of a flooded engine. This fusion of high-level intellect and grounded practical skill is what made her uniquely qualified to solve the Merlin's puzzle. Her decision to conduct an unauthorized test was perhaps the most crucial element of her story. It was an act of calculated rebellion, a declaration that human lives were more important than bureaucratic procedure. In that single brave choice, she and the small team at RAF Kenley demonstrated that initiative and common sense could be more powerful weapons than any regulation. They understood the urgency in a way that distant administrators could not, and their willingness to risk their careers saved the lives of men they would never meet. The estimated 2,100 pilots saved is a number so large it's difficult to comprehend. It is not just a statistic. It represents entire squadrons that continued to fight. It represents a wealth of combat experience that was preserved within fighter command, allowing veteran pilots to pass on their knowledge to the next generation of flyers. It represents fathers and sons who came home. Every time a Spitfire or Hurricane safely pulled out of a dive after April 1941, the silent legacy of Beatrice Schilling was there, riding in the cockpit with the pilot. In the grand tapestry of the Second World War, a conflict defined by continent-spanning battles and industrial might, the story of Miss Schilling's Orifice is a vital, human-scale thread. It reminds us that victory was built not only on the output of vast factories, but on moments of individual brilliance. It proves that the most complex problems can sometimes yield to the simplest solutions, and that the most effective weapon is, and always will be, a well-reasoned idea in a determined mind. The small piece of brass, costing mere pennies to produce, was an elegant counterpoint to the brutal calculus of war, a quiet triumph of intellect over chaos.